When my son was younger, I did this a lot, and I have regrets. What is this I did? I explained away his behavior to friends, family, even strangers to try to avoid judgment or just keep the peace. So today, I want to talk about the decisions we make about when or whether to explain something, when it makes sense to explain, how to do it without sounding like you're apologizing for your child's existence, and why it's okay to make different decisions depending on the situation. The idea here is to help you think about it when you're not in the thick of that uncomfortable moment. Because in that moment, it's so tough to process this decision in that environment. And reacting in the moment without the forethought is what led to some of my regrets. Let's talk about that pressure. Sometimes when our children are out in public and they're behaving differently, or they're having a meltdown, or they're just doing something that is causing people to stare, we feel pressure like we owe an explanation. Though we generally don't owe anyone an explanation, sometimes explaining helps reduce misunderstanding or create safety for your child. So the better question to ask yourself is, what's the purpose of explaining in this moment? And to think about what the purpose might be, you want to ask yourself, will this help my child? Will this create a better outcome? Am I explaining to protect or to be approved of? So to whom might you choose to explain? First, you might explain to family members. It really depends on the relationship and the history, and again, the purpose. If you want family members to better understand your child, it might be a good opportunity to help that along. With strangers or bystanders, it's completely optional. You want to choose based on what you need in the moment. For your child's peers or other children, you want to be brief and clear and age appropriate if you decide to explain at all. So for example, my son didn't have any language when he was younger. So he wanted to play alongside other children, but when they talked to him, he couldn't talk back. So they would sometimes come up to me and say, "Why doesn't he talk?" And I would say, "Well, he just doesn't talk as well as you do yet, but he understands, so you keep talking to him." Brief, clear, no apologies. Teachers and professionals present a tricky issue, which you wouldn't think, but hear me out. Of course, you want to explain to teachers and other professionals everything you can about your child that might be relevant to them helping your child. What does sometimes happen is if your child, say you bring them to school one day and they're struggling a little bit and you start apologizing for them, or a teacher calls you about something that your child did in school, and again, you apologize for them. That, I think you want to be really careful about. It's those kinds of things that I do have some regrets over. And here's why. I think I was doing that because I was trying to avoid judgment. I was somehow thinking that they were thinking that I was doing it all wrong, so I wound up apologizing for him, and it just wasn't necessary. You get to choose how much access and what kind of access other people have to your child's story. Let's move on to how to explain without apologizing. So the idea here is that you want to offer insight, but not ask permission. So here would be an example of asking permission or apologizing. You might say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. He just has trouble behaving sometimes." Instead, you might offer something like, "He just needs a bit more support when things change quickly. We've got it handled." It's a much more positive explanation and still an accurate one. A really common one is when our children stim in public. Something you could say in that moment, if you felt the need to explain, is this is what helps them function best. Another option, if they do something that draws stares, might be, "Thanks for your patience. This is what works for us." Sometimes people look at us in a way that they're thinking, "That's so rude." And if you feel like you want to offer an explanation, you might just say, "It's not rude, they just communicate differently." Explaining doesn't mean shrinking. It means helping others show up better if they're willing to. Another thing we need to talk about here is that your child hears you when you talk about them. Sometimes, especially when our children are non-speaking or they have difficulty with language, we tend to think that they're not tuning in or they don't understand, and that's a mistake. Our kids, who tend to be highly sensitive, they process more than we think, especially the emotional tone. So when you say, "He's difficult," or "She just doesn't get it," they may not understand every word, but they feel the vibe. They feel how others are perceiving them. That's why it's so important to use language that reflects respect and belief in their capacity, even when you're under pressure. That tiny shift, it protects your child's dignity and it protects your connection too. Now let's talk about when an apology might actually be appropriate, because Sometimes apologizing is the right thing to do. It can be a relationship-preserving choice or just a respectful thing to do. So, for example, if your child is disruptive while you're getting into a seat at a movie theater, you might say, "Thanks for your patience while we got settled." That's a form of an apology without being overly apologetic. Or something that I faced a lot, my son from time to time touched things or people inappropriately. I've talked before about how he had a thing about bald heads, and sometimes on the subway platform in New York City, it was hard to avoid them. So you might say something like, "I'm sorry that he touched you." That's it. Simple, straightforward. But sometimes that person is owed an apology. What you don't want to do is something that's along the lines of apologizing for your child's needs or even their existence. Something like, "I'm sorry he's so difficult." You don't need to go there. You can acknowledge the impact their behavior might have had without blaming your child or yourself. Sometimes our different backgrounds, cultures, and histories, they shape how comfortable we feel speaking up or staying silent. So there's no universal right way. The goal is for you to feel in alignment, not to please everybody else. You don't need to be defensive and you don't need to be silent. You can choose to explain clearly, compassionately, and unapologetically. You are your child's advocate, protector, and translator, but you don't need to be their PR manager. You don't owe anyone a perfect narrative. You just choose what serves your child and your values, not what quiets someone else's discomfort. I hope you found this helpful today. If you did, please consider giving it a like and consider subscribing if you haven't already. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one.